Well, hello, writers. Welcome to episode number 93 of How Do You Write? I'm Rachael Herron, and I am so glad that you're here today. Especially excited for this show. It is with Jeffrey Foucault, who is one of my favorite singers of all time. And I love him not only for his voice, but also mostly, I have to say, for his songwriting. He is a songwriter of the highest caliber. He is a poet. I I have to apologize in advance because I fangirl pretty damn hard on him, and he was a gentleman and put up with it throughout. He is on the road as we recorded this. Blood Brothers is coming out today, so you should go get it. His voice is incredible and his writing is incredible. I'm telling you. But for that reason, we don't have video portion for him. He's an old-fashioned kind of guy. We recorded over the phone, and bless his heart, he hung with me on those technical difficulties, just like Brenda did last week with the Skype difficulties. It's just been a technically challenging week. But we managed, and the interview is fabulous. We completely veer from the questions, and some of my favorite interviews are those exactly, the ones that veer all the way away because you're just connecting and talking and listening. And I really wanted a songwriter on the show, and to have him on the show is just incredible. So I know you'll enjoy. A little bit of update before we jump into that. I have really good news that I can't share. So I'm one of those people, but I bet you can guess what it was. The thing that I've been hopeful for a while now happened. Actually, I got notification that it happened about 5 minutes before I talked to Jeffrey and kept my cool on that. I just pretended like it hadn't happened because otherwise I would have just been losing my mind. And I did kind of lose my mind. It was such a good day that after I got off the phone with him and confirmed the good thing with my agent, I went back to bed to just kind of stare at the back of my eyeballs. Because sometimes I have a stress response that is like a fainting goat. I just fall right over on my side and wait for the emotions to pass. So I did that. But I will share that with you as soon as I possibly can, I promise. Sorry to be a tease about that. New Patreon supporter. Thank you, Eleanor Kos is what I'm going to guess your last name is. I'm sorry if I butchered it. It's so wonderful to have you along. I hope you enjoy the essays. There's 17 of them up there. Anybody else who would like to support can go to patreon.com/Rachel. And thank you so very much, all of you who support. It means the difference to me in being able to do this and being able to write the essays. Thank you with all my heart. This morning I started a new book. Yay! I have been plotting for once. This time I'm going back to romance. I'm going to finish the Ballard Brothers series, and it's the third in the series, and I'd kind of lost the train of where that series was. It's been a while since I wrote romance. And I was talking to Jay Thorne, who is my podcast partner over at The Pedal to the Metal. The Pedal to the Metal. Go check it out. And Jay is a certified story grid instructor. And what that means is he has learned the story grid method that Sean Coyne came up with, and he is certified to teach it. I have always felt like I always love to learn new story structure ideas. We're all saying the same thing. We're all talking about stories with a beginning, a middle, and an end that satisfies a reader. However, there's a million ways to look at how to do that, and I've kind of taken what I love from all of them and incorporated them into my own system. But I had been neglecting the story grid because honestly, that book is big and it looks confusing, and there's a lot of charts and numbers, and I just wasn't into it. And Jay started talking with me about a month ago about my plot. It just came up organically in our chats, and we have now done three plot fundamental episodes, 1, 2, and 3. And basically, we plotted my next book together. And some of the things I learned from the story grid architecture were kind of mind blowing. Like, I Love them. I've always been good at starting. I've always been good at having a compelling hook and an inciting incident. But of course, we all bog down around that soggy middle of a novel. And this method really kind of keeps you up and going. So if you're interested in that, go to the pedal to the metal on your favorite podcast device and look up Plot Fundamentals 1, 2, and 3. And we had a really good time, and we've had a massive response to it. So go check it out, please. And also, while I'm pimping stuff, I have 2 new writing retreats up. Venice for next year in 2019 in April is up. It is available to be held. You can hold your spot. I'm doing it a lot earlier this year because it is so fantastic and it sells out so fast. So go check that out if you like. Also, a more budget version in September. I'm going to be taking a group of writers to the Pigeon Point Lighthouse Hostel, which is on the West Coast near rugged Pescadero, a little bit south of Half Moon Bay, and it's a hostel. So these are dorm rooms. You're saying we're sharing a dorm room with bunk beds, but we have the whole house. It's right on the cliffside, and there's a hot tub that overlooks the water that we can reserve if we want to. There's a fantastic restaurant a little bit inland. So go check that out. You can go to rachelherron.com/write, scroll to the bottom, and the information will be at the bottom there. So let's jump into the interview with Jeffrey. You're going to be his newest, biggest fan, but do not try to unseat me because I'm still in the front row. So you can sit next to me at the next show, but he's so great. Enjoy, please, and keep me posted on how you're doing, how your writing is going. You know that I always really want to know. And happy writing to you, my friends. I could not be more pleased to welcome Jeffrey Foucault to the show today. Hello, Jeffrey.
Hello, how are you?
I'm so thrilled and a little bit fangirlish. But let me give you a little bit of a bio before we start chatting. Jeffrey Foucault lives out in New England in a little town with a river in the middle. He grew up in Wisconsin, and at 19, he stole a copy of Townes Van Zant's Live and Obscure. At 24, he made a record and started traveling around the country. He has 2 older brothers who don't sing, but they both fish. He can't get home without crossing good water, and it barely makes up for living east, he says, which isn't in his blood. He has a chicken coop and a little barn and an old truck that runs. He likes to listen to records real loud when he does the dishes, and he does most of the dishes. And I have to say that as a bio, that shows why I love your work so much. You are a true poet of the earth, of the soil, of the land, and I have to say that I have been a fan since Ghost Repeater came out, and that was 2006. I just looked up. I can't remember where I found you, but I actually fell in love with your wife, the lovely Kris Delmhorst. Before that, I think it was on her first album. So that was before y'all were together, and
Yeah.
and then when I found out that you were together, I thought, well, that is just something. That I like that you've kept talent that I love all in one house. And I was lucky enough to see you both at the Freight and Salvage a few months ago here in Berkeley.
Oh,
So
cool. Right, all right.
That was a great show. That was so fun to see both of you together. That I'd never seen both of you sing together, so although I've seen you several times. But I've never had a songwriter on my show, so I'm really interested in process. And I would love to know what your writing process is like. Where do the fertile and the fallow times come, and how do you get that kind of work done?
Well, I think it's probably real similar to any other kind of writing discipline, and it's discipline in the sense that it's something you have to be doing all the time. I mean, it's the old saw people use, writers write, and if you're not writing, and you're not putting yourself in the path of getting some kind of good work done, by making sure that you're the person who's sitting there with a pencil or a typewriter or whatever it is, then it doesn't matter how many good ideas you have, because you won't be in a place where you can get them down unless you just make a point of showing up there.
So sorry, this is a pain in the ass. I will edit.
That's okay. Like I spend a bunch of time on the road, and we just are constantly dealing with technology and how much more complicated it makes everything for no apparent reason. Like I was trying to check into the Hilton Hotel in Milwaukee, I guess night before last. And, you stand there. They have your credit card and they have your name, and it's unclear what else they need. And yet it takes 15 minutes for them to, I don't know if they're playing like Pac-Man on the computer while they, it takes forever.
Well, that's a good segue into the fact that you are on the road right now for the album Blood Brothers, which comes out the day this episode releases. So if you're listening, it is out now. I have already pre-ordered it, of course. What is your process like when you're on the road? Do you just give up songwriting when you're doing this kind of tour, or do you still work on writing when you're out?
I still work on writing. It's more catch as catch can. When I'm home off the road, I tend to get up early and get the first couple hours of the day while my wife and daughter are still asleep and the house is pretty quiet. I like to get up and, if it's not the dead of summer, I'll make a fire in the wood stove and I'll sit there. I often start by reading poetry in the morning because I feel like it organizes my mind, and it's a good space to be in first thing in the morning, to take something that isn't necessarily linear and let the language, hit your brain when your brain is not in a particularly linear organization anyway, 'cause you just came out of your dreams. The writer Jim Harrison, I went to his place a couple times and mostly to sit and commiserate with him. He had shingles at the end of his life and he wasn't in real good shape. And so the first time I went to his place, we went to just sit outside and talk and drink a little wine and kind of be company. And then we took him fishing on the Yellowstone one time, me and my friend Kris Delmhorst, who's a writer as well. And Harrison's deal was that he would work really frequently after sleeping, and he would organize his sleep schedule so he could be ready to work. And he would, we one time we had dinner in his kitchen, and then we were leaving, and it was probably 7:00, and he was going to bed. He had a bed in his office, and he was going to go lay down, and he said he was going to sleep until about 11, and then he'd wake up and probably write for 2 or 3 hours, and then he'd go back to sleep, and he'd dream, and then he'd write again when he woke up in the morning. And that was one of his techniques. I don't take it quite that far, but I do think that the early morning is a pretty fertile time, and it's not a time that's entirely available to me on the road because, for instance, most nights I'm going to be up until 2 or 3. And then I could get up at 7, and sometimes I do, but it's pretty rare, I'm certainly not up at 5. So, writing on the road means keeping a notebook on your lap and writing down little fragments and lines and things as you're traveling along. But, what the biggest difference, honestly, is if I have a driver. If I have a driver on the tour, I can get a lot of work done. Or if I'm, like I've taken tours in Europe where I was on the train, and if you're sitting on the train, it's like the best place to write songs. I mean, a good song to me is the equivalent of sitting on a train looking out the window. So I feel like it's a natural environment.
I feel like the train, when I've written on trains, the train reorganizes my brain in a way that I cannot get anywhere else. There's nothing like it.
So it's an interesting thing to think about, but your brain physiologically, you have an orienting response where your brain is continually assessing the environment for change, because change is often a threat, historically speaking. And so when you stare at a fire and it continually flickers and changes shape, that tends to stimulate that orienting response and trigger it over and over again, and it puts you in almost a trance-like state. It's why people watch TV when there's nothing on. It's why that little kids really shouldn't be watching TV, because it messes with their neural development. We've all seen that little kid that watches too much TV, and then they look kind of dazed the rest of the time because the rest of the world just seems to move too slowly.
That may explain why I don't like to have a TV on ever. It's my worst nightmare to be in some kind of hospital with a television on, because it stresses me out so much. Unless I'm watching a fantastic show, and then of course I'm just like anybody else and love to be in it.
Yeah.
Let me ask you too. Besides songs and your incredible newsletters that I know I'm really fangirling, but when I get your newsletter, I get a lot of people's newsletters, but I'll save yours to read later, even if I know that I'm not on, the tour. It's just your kind of writing. Do you do any other writing? Have you ever had aspirations for a novel or anything like that?
Yeah, I have plenty of aspirations, and I haven't got too much farther than that, but I kept what I call a record book, which mostly because I always felt like the word journal was sort of twee and overused, but it amounts to the same thing. I have one book where I'm writing songs, poems, grocery lists, lists of things I need to get done, and then I have one book that's usually sort of fair copy songs where, it might be the left side is a working draft and the right side is a fair copy, and I won't commit to the right side until the left side seems to make some sense, but allows me to move stuff around. And then I have a book where I'm just writing what's going on and how I feel about it. It's not therapeutic in the sense, in the sort of stricter sense of like, I'm not assassinating anybody's character or writing anything down that I wouldn't want somebody to read. It's not that private. It's essentially that I wanted to be a good writer, and you have to write a lot of sentences to become even a halfway decent writer and begin to understand not only the mechanics of writing, but you have to get it out of your system, all your attempts to be clever or to come off as erudite. It's better to just be simple and clear, and even that takes a lot of practice. And with a lot of practice, you might have something that resembles a style emerge, if you're lucky. And even that style may just be something as simple as the way that you use commas or the way that you introduce ideas. I have noticed that I have a tendency to be sort of recursive in the way that I present information, and I almost never can get an entire idea out without using dashes or parentheses, because I like to loop back. And I don't know that might just be that I always drink coffee when I'm working on stuff, but I always have three ideas where one would get by.
Yeah, in your songs, of course, you edit down, and that doesn't show at all. Your songs are they're just presented as plain facts with really surprising observations that seem obvious when you hear them. My wife and I always talk about, the best country song is the one that when you hear it, you can't figure out how it wasn't always in the world. And and that's when you know something is working, and your songs are like that to me. So, it's just so cool to talk to you about this. What is your biggest challenge when it comes to writing?
Well, first of all, thanks. That's very kind of you. And then biggest challenge, the biggest challenge is the internet, and I'll explain what I mean by saying that 10, 12 years ago, say, for instance, Ghost Repeater, that record that you mentioned, I cut that in December of 2005 in Iowa City. I had the art in process. I hired out the design to a guy down in Austin that I liked his work, and I'd seen his work at an exposition called Flatstock that they used to have at South by Southwest. I had the art in 2 months or so. And the master, I think we mixed in January. The record was mastered by February. It was in the hands of the record label and being promoted overseas by March, and in April I went on tour in Europe, and we released it there first for some obscure reason I no longer recall. And then we came back and we released it stateside in May. And that amount of time that elapsed, my main job was to get the record out into the world, but I hired a lot of it done, and I had a record label to help me. And then otherwise, I was just home, and I didn't have a kid yet, and I was on the road a little bit, but, sometimes you have to go kind of off the road for a little while while you're waiting for a record to come out. And I didn't have, outside of probably some email of a fairly mechanical nature, daily, dealing with stuff with my manager at the time, I didn't have anything to do with the internet, and I had no reason to. There was no MySpace, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was no Instagram, and all of these parallel platforms that we all shoehorn ourselves voluntarily into now and sort of get rid of anything that's interesting or uniquely identifying about what we do. Those things didn't exist, and I find that in the last 5 years or so, somebody who's making art is required to also possess the skill set of a marketing account, manager, and a brand manager, and a social media advertiser, and an enterprising pimp. And I don't really enjoy any of that work. I know how to do it, and I've been talked into it by the people who I work with, because, your agent wants to book you shows, and you make their life more difficult by hiding, not being willing to do stuff. Or the clubs, like it used to be, the club was called a promoter, and a promoter promoted a show, because you didn't live there, you lived 3,000 miles away. And it was real hard for you to tell anybody. But now, because of the flat landscape of the digital economy, I'm as responsible for promoting a show in Berkeley as the promoter is in Berkeley. And
that sucks.
Well, it's expensive for one. When a record comes out, you might have a publicist out. But anyway, this is all just the dross of my mind. We were talking about writing. What I find difficult is separating the part of me that is a frustrated businessman who has to sit there doing data entry work from the person who should be spending all of his time writing music, playing music, recording music, and thinking about music. And that sort of watertight bulkhead operation in my mind and soul is difficult to maintain at all times. And I feel like the frustration with our sort of fake internet world bleeds over into my work life in a way that I find pretty much unacceptable. I'm beginning to think about ways to just drop out, which I think they mostly all add up to making less money and playing for less people, and which it may just have to be the way it goes.
Yeah. I kind of break myself up into a writer in the morning and a marketer in the afternoon, but I have to tell you that I hate afternoons.
Well, it's like a recipe for alcoholism, I think. I mean,
I'm actually in recovery, so yes.
Okay, well, there you go. Right, so it can be very difficult to get through the day and then try to take all that stuff and find a healthy place to deal with it, as opposed to just either tamping it down or drowning it.
Yep, I choose to drown it. I've been doing this thing: instead of drinking at night, I get in the bath. So. And I'm done with the marketing. It works pretty well. What is your biggest joy in writing?
The only part of writing that I find really joyful as opposed to satisfying is the discovery of meaning, in the sense that your brain coughs up something that you don't have any real authorship of. I mean, you're accessing something that's outside of you. That's what it seems like to me. So, and you know, I mean, there's a empirical biologist, scientist named Rupert Sheldrake that Billy and I read some of his stuff. Billy is my drummer, or rather, I guess I'm his singer, perhaps. Anyway, we talk about this guy Sheldrake in the car a lot because he has an idea about memory and its relationship to genomic expression. Essentially, his idea is that we don't understand genetics very well, and we don't understand how information travels between human beings. One of his ideas is that memory doesn't exist in your brain any more than a picture exists inside a television set. It's a transmission from somewhere else, and what he calls a morphic field, or a field determined by shape and relationship, the same way that gravity, for instance, is a field that we treat it like a fact. But the truth is, gravity is an unseen behavior of forces that we don't entirely understand, you know, from a mechanical aspect. And I think there's a good argument to be made that memory works the same way. And what's interesting to me is when I am tuned into the broadcast of the rest of humanity, whatever that is. I mean, you know, you dream about people at night and you see their faces, and those are people you never met, right? Do they exist? Did you see them somewhere in passing, and your brain just trotted them out for your entertainment at night? I don't think so. I mean, I think all that human information probably resides on a different plane of existence altogether. Not unlike some of the religious ideas, you know, the Akashic record or that sort of thing. And the joyful part of writing to me is when you are pretty sure, and this is truthfully the joyful part of playing music too, it's when you tap into that thing, when you become, you put yourself in relationship to it, as opposed to that feeling of authorship, you know, which is where you start when, you know, it's such a leap of ego when you're a youngster to be like, I have some ideas that people really need to hear. Right? I mean,
and all writers have that, you know. Well, I must tell my truth.
Yeah, and it's, you know, it's mostly silliness, but there's some communicative urge that we all seem to have. Harrison had a great line about, you know, what writers have in common is an overweening sense of personal destiny, and I've always thought that was a great way to describe it. But you know, the truth is the best stuff doesn't really have that much to do with you. The satisfaction comes when you have created something wherever it came from, and then you go back and you get to shape it. You know, work on it the way that you'd work on a painting or a poem or a sculpture or something. That's very. There's a calm version of joy that attends to that, but I don't. I feel like I know some people who don't enjoy writing, and yet they write, and I've always wondered what that was about. You know, I know a lot of people who enjoy having written songs, but they don't particularly enjoy the process, or they find the process disconcerting. And I've always felt like if you're doing it right, it feels more like a story that you never quite come to the end of. You know, you're always excited to pick it up and look into it.
I always feel like it's a story that I'm never going to get quite right either. It turns out right when I'm done. When I'm done with a book or a project, it turns out that it comes out the way it was meant to be, but my vision never comes true. Which is fine. I think that's
question, isn't it?
Yeah. And for me, that calm joy that you mentioned comes to me in the revision process, which I love more than anything else about writing. And describing it as calm joy is exactly that. It can be frustrating and all of the other things, but the the clarity that you're in the right place when you're doing that revision is just one of the best things in the world to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I always felt like when I was getting going, and there are parallels obviously here. I think in terms of music as much as I think in terms of writing. And when I was a youngster, there were a lot of things I had to learn. You know, you begin by just learning how to play a guitar, or in my case, a guitar, and sing, right? And there's a steep learning curve. You're never quite done learning either of those things. But you learn the basic mechanics. And then the moment you know what you're doing, you say, oh, I know, well, now I'm going to cut a record. And the first thing you do is sing into a microphone with some headphones on, neither of which you've ever done in your life. Doesn't make any sense, right? So the first thing you do is change everything about the way you do it. So again, there's a new learning curve, and then you have to learn how to use the studio and the various methods of engineering that create different sounds. And then you start thinking about, all right, well, I love how this person plays, and I love how this person plays, and I hire these people, and then we're going to play together. And that's a new thing. And then maybe it doesn't sound anything like what you thought it would. And that distance between what you were describing in writing, you know, it's a gulf between conception and execution. And I felt like when I was just starting, I would be like, you know, here, I want to make this record, and I would have an idea what I wanted to do, and man, it never turned out anything like what I was going for. It just didn't. And then the further I went along, that I would narrow that gap between conception and execution. But the truth is, once you know how to do something, it becomes drastically uninteresting. So you have to be willing to mess it up and sort of lob a hand grenade in in the middle of it, and then see what happens. I've always been interested in people that, like I have a friend who used to tech for Neil Young, and he said the moment everybody, and this is a major crew, multiple buses, people who are doing lighting, people who are doing sound, people who are checking all the instruments, all that stuff, and then just the people who make you keep it all in the rails, tour managers, stuff like that. And he said the moment this team of people knew exactly what they were doing, and the show was just running in greased grooves, Neil Young would change the entire thing because he hated it when people were comfortable. And at the time I thought that was sort of perverse, and then now I totally understand why you would do that, because there has to be that uncertainty, because that's where interesting things happen.
There's that great David Bowie quote that I'm going to mangle, but it's something like, if you feel like you're in the part of the pool where you're about to drown, then you're exactly in the right place.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just healthy to have a certain amount of, I don't know, there's a relationship between fear and mastery, and there's room for both of those things. They have to exist in a sort of countervailing apparatus. And I'm out on the road, for instance, right now with a bunch of guys who are decidedly masters of the instruments that they play, and real mastery requires not only, of course, 10,000 hours and all the sort of Oprah style like jargoning that we all know about, but it specifically requires, to my mind, it requires this human approach. Like there's an aspect of humanity that enters into real mastery, so that when I hear my guys setting up, for example, the first time I hear Billy hit the drum, it's Billy, and he sounds like he's hit the drum with perfect intention. And that's, you hear somebody plug in a guitar and immediately start, wanking away, and you think, well, that's not interesting at all. Even if they know all the notes in the world, it's just not that interesting. But you hear somebody plug in, and if they play with intention, that they bring that mastery to it, they're always ready, right? They're always ready to play there must be an analog in writing. I'm sure, I remember reading Kerouac's letters where he's talking about his batting average. It was how he described the number of words that he could crank out in a day. And obviously this is Kerouac we're talking about, but I thought that idea, the sort of batting average was interesting. That he was thinking in terms of his ratio of success on any given day, like that he knew he was in a place where he was making good work. That's an interesting thing.
Yeah, I a lot of times I'll have a word count goal for the day, and it does feel, it's just business. I sit down and I hopefully write with intention, but generally it's about 2,000 words a day, and I know every day that right around word 800 is where my brain kicks in and it suddenly starts to become what it needs to become. But those first 800 words are usually thrown away because they're my warm up,
Well, and that's a really valuable lesson. Anybody that writes, you learn as you go along that all of the stuff that you did that seemed to be a blind alley was just really important, and you had to write through the stuff that didn't go anywhere in order to write the stuff that went somewhere. And when you're 22, you think, well, everything that I come up with has to be genius, like from the beginning,
without requiring edits. Even it comes out
right,
perfectly.
And if it didn't work, it would never occur to you at that point to set it aside and come back to it later, or to take it apart, sort of tinker with it and see on a purely architectural level what made it sound or unsound, and then compost it and say, there's a cool line here, and 10 years from now that line's going to make it into a song, and it's true. But you need the 10 years to figure out that it's true, and that's where that's where there's some value in being the wily veteran as opposed to the strong youngster. I don't know.
Heck yeah. Well, we veered off questions, and I don't want to take too much more of your time, but this has been fantastic. Can you please tell us about Blood Brothers? What's the impetus for this?
Well, let's see. I mean, the impetus for the record was simply enough that it was time for me to make a record. It's, you want to be putting out an album every couple of years. I have never been real strict about that, and I've never been real strict. I always tried to let the creative process take me wherever I was going, and and frequently where you go is the place where you need some work. So, there were a few years after I made that Ghost Repeater record where, I pretty much had made a record I knew how to make, and it was about right as a snapshot of what I was capable of doing at the time. But every book or every album is going to be sort of not all baseball. Like it's one version of all these other things that feed into it. So you listen to that record and you're like, all right, well, this is basically like a bunch of country and folk songs played with a band that bends them toward the blues a little bit, because Bo is essentially a blues guitar player, and that rhythm section kind of worked that way too. Well, did that give you any indication that I listened to Led Zeppelin for most of the year I was 14? Probably not, or that the first record I ever bought was Little Richard, like early rock and roll was in there, or that I could play bottleneck slide guitar. Like I didn't play bottleneck slide guitar in public until I'd been doing it for 20 years or something, And so finding ways to sort of shore up your deal has always been interesting to me, and going off into the woods a little bit. And, so I made a couple side projects. Here's one of, where I was sort of investigating the influence of John Prine on my own work, as I started playing by learning John Prine songs. Or there's one that was all murder ballads. That was just kind of a lark. I don't even remember how we started doing that. And then there was one where I was collaborating with a poet. My friend Lisa Olstein, whose books come out on Copper Canyon Press. And I was collaborating with a poet, which was great because it allowed me to shelve my egotism about the language and really be more of a curator of language. And also it allowed me to, this freedom that I hadn't felt before to, write a rock and roll song and take the paint off the walls. And so, that first one is the Cold Satellite records. There were two, and, the first one's more like somewhere between the Faces and the Rolling Stones. And the second one, there's a bunch of pretty sideways, pretty heavy duty rock and roll on that record. So you go out and you do all these things. The new record, I felt like, one, it's time to make a record, and two, there's a record that I felt like I was leaning toward that involved steel body resonator guitar and my electric guitar playing, and I wasn't ready to make that record. Neither of those things ended up on this record. What I did was I booked a studio. I wrote most of the songs in about 6 weeks, and I made a record that I knew how to make, using pretty traditional lyrical sort of narrative structures. And I tried pretty consciously to be fairly simple and to avoid a lot of heavy metaphorical language. A lot of these songs are fairly straightforward, and they rely on what's told and when it's told and how it's told, as opposed to using a lot of abstraction in the language. And I made that record that I knew how to make, and I played acoustic guitar the way I knew how to play it, really to buy myself the time to make a more complicated record that involves a little more uncertainty. Because it's time to make a record, and I think in terms of body of work. I really don't think in terms of having a hit ever in my life. That's not something I expect. So
Me too.
Right.
I
so
just keep producing books, and maybe I don't think I'll ever have a big hit, but I just keep writing.
Yeah, and if the need for a big hit is your driving deal, I mean, maybe that's a good engine for your work or something. But if it's going to make you upset or bitter, then it's probably not a healthy place to be. Like, what's interesting to me is paying the mortgage and paying the people I work with who are beautiful musicians and great company. Like, I want to pay them fairly so they can pay their mortgage. And that requires a certain amount of just labor on my part. And it was time to put a record out and time to tour that record. And so I made a record that I knew how to make. And I'm actually, it took me a while. You never know with an album. Sometimes it's probably this way with a book too. Sometimes you know exactly what you're doing the whole time. And in spite of yourself, perhaps, you know exactly what you're doing. And then sometimes you have no idea. It's the difference between being on the crest of a wave and being up over the horizon, being able to see everything real clearly, and or being in the trough of the wave, and everywhere you look is just blue. And this one, I really. What's interesting, I'm sure you feel the same way, because I would be willing to bet it's the same for people who make art in a general way, but you can do something where you know what you're doing, and you can walk away from that with a certain amount of confidence. You're like, all right, I got this down. Like, I know what I'm doing now, And there's even an element of almost swagger in it. And then, no matter who you think you are, some time will go by, and you will be in the woods again, and all of that swagger will just seem ridiculous, and you will think, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. And this record, I couldn't even really hear it very clearly. I could hear all the constituent elements of it, but it was difficult for me to get any sense of what was there right up until it was already mastered and it was going away. And at the last moment, I cut one song off of it. We recorded 16. I had a 12-song sequence, cut that down to an 11-song sequence, and committed to getting the record mastered, which is the last step. And then there was a mechanical issue with the master, and it gave me the opportunity to reconsider. And I was like, you know what? This is a 10-song record, and I'm cutting off this one. Sort of, it was a blues rock and roll song that just didn't fit with the rest of the song, which is a more lilt, or the rest of the album, which is a more lilting album that really doesn't rely on the blues form at all, or even, I mean, there's one sort of quasi rock and roll tune, but you know, that's it. And so I got rid of that one, and then and then all of a sudden I was like, oh, that's the record. And ever since I've kind of had a picture of it in my mind, but sometimes it takes a long time. You got to get away from it before you get that sense of the outline of anything.
Yeah. Sometimes I have the books that I swear write themselves, and I turn around and they're done. And then the other ones I have that I fight the whole way, and I hate everything about them the whole way. And then there's this one moment where something just shunks into place, and it becomes what it was meant to be, and it's worth the agony. But it's hard. That's hard.
Yep.
So
yeah.
I can't wait to get this
hard.
album.
It's not. Oh, thanks. Yeah. I was just gonna say it is hard. Well, I think about this a lot. I was corresponding with my friend Dave Moore, who's a great songwriter from Iowa, who I just saw. But leading up to our playing in Iowa, I was on. We were like writing letters back and forth, and we were sort of commiserating about some of the difficulty that I described with dealing with the interweb and all the nonsense that you are sort of forced to wade through. And it's hard, right? And some of the frustration that goes along with creative work is also hard. And then at the same time, I always think to myself, like, I had a job where I had to be up at 4:45 and walk in the Wisconsin winter to maintenance shop and service cars. It was, like service cars, you can like top up the oil and all the fluids and clean the whole thing and make sure the windows are clean and then turn them back out into service. I wasn't doing the engines. I was just like servicing cars, like a moron kind of job. And I was wearing a mechanic's jumpsuit, and I was exhausted. Most of the time I was going to bed early, and it was a really hard job. Like cleaning bathrooms is a hard job. And most of the people in the world have a much harder job than I do. So I always think to myself, like, most of the people in the world are having a difficult time, and it's hard to take special pleading from a songwriter.
I feel the same way about being a novelist. I'm not digging a ditch today. Although I just realized that's a lie. I do need to go put in a tree. But it'll be a very, very small ditch, and it's my choice. So,
right.
Well, everybody, listeners, go grab Blood Brothers by Jeffrey Foucault, and it has been such an honor to talk to you today. Thank you for taking time out of the tour to talk to me and dealing with technical issues. And I hope that the rest of your tour goes smoothly. No more tech glitches. And that you just have a marvelous time, and that it flies off the shelves.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel. It was a pleasure to get to talk to you.
Thanks so much. Take care.
All right.
Bye.